Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Sorry, because we had some technical problems connecting both platforms to the YouTube. So now we are ready to begin again. I'm Pere Almeda, Director of the Center for Contemporary Studies, the in-house think tank of the Catalan government. Thanks for joining us today, finally, on this new discussion online. Today is the fourth debate of our series of events organized by the Center for Contemporary Studies, analyzing the impact of COVID in our societies. In the past debates, we have focused on the economic and social impacts and recovery scenarios and global health issues. On the next events, we'll be also exploring the gender dimension of this crisis and its geopolitical impacts and the democratic challenges it poses. Today's discussion is organized jointly by the Center for Contemporary Studies and Diplocat, Catalonia's Public Diplomacy Council, and we will analyze one of the crucial issues in terms of political power and territorial politics on managing the coronavirus crisis. The title of this debate, Centralization versus Decentralization against COVID-19, want to reflect with a comparative perspective how different countries have dealt with this unprecedented emergency. The purpose of this debate is to learn from best practices of countries with different political systems and to be better prepared for future scenarios. With nothing else to add, I would like to pass the floor to the Secretary for Foreign Action and European Union of the Catalan government, Eli Nebreda, who will address some welcome words. Thank you.
Thank you, Pere. And again, apologies for all these technical problems that we just had. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us in today's session, Centralization versus Decentralization Strategies to Fight COVID-19, organized, as Pere said, jointly by the Center for Contemporary Studies and Diplocat. Let me spare you further greeting remarks and let's get down to the thick of it. There's no denying the COVID-19 crisis has put us through some challenging times. The threat to our health systems, the economy, and our rights and freedoms, among others, has been almost unprecedented. And even though the worst might be behind us in Europe, in many other areas of the world, they're still facing the critical scenarios, so we still have a lot of ground to cover. As we sailed into this uncharted territory, many tough decisions caught governments unequipped, unprepared, and at times even uninformed, or at least not properly informed. This is to say that these decisions relied solely on the pre-existing infrastructure and know-how. At that juncture, this emergency exposed the political structure and culture of each country. In countries like Canada, for instance, with a strong federal background, the burden of these decisions was shared among the various levels of governance, and the same happened in many other countries with a federal system. However, in Spain, a country where the autonomous regime is less firmly established, the central government declared a state of alarm and de facto withdrew all the autonomous communities' competences to establish a single decision body in Madrid, disregarding thus, during these exceptional times, the decentralized system established by the Spanish Constitution. Nevertheless, as I said, these decisions were made under exceptional circumstances, and it is not my intention to make of this debate a political controversy over Spain's response to the COVID-19 crisis. On the contrary, we believe it is time for an unemotional and in-depth analysis of how the world has responded to the pandemic and learn more from the mistakes, but also from the successes in case we need to take more and better decisions in the near future. The government of Catalonia is committed to bringing together experts and academics to debate on COVID-19's impact in our societies, and this is precisely what we're doing with this series of events and debates organized by the Center for Contemporary Studies and Diplocat. In this sense, we are delighted to have today such a splendid group of speakers to dwell on the democratic dilemma of centralization versus decentralization of powers when managing the pandemic. The conclusions of this and the forthcoming sessions will be shared with the government's working group for the post-COVID reconstruction, and we will take into account all the contributions and ideas for future assessments. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Diplocat Secretary General, Mrs. Laura Foraster, who will be announcing the series of debates that we're launching today. Laura, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary. And let me apologize as well for this delay due to technical problems. Good afternoon to everybody and welcome to the first online debate of the Diplocat Digital Talk series that will analyze the world after COVID-19 from a decentralizing perspective. We're excited to organize this first talk with the Center for Contemporary Studies of the Government of Catalonia. I'm happy to announce here and now that the next talk, scheduled for next Monday, 29 June, will be on sustainability and economic recovery, held together with Catalonia's Advisory Council for Sustainable Development. The following debate will address topics such as the new productive models of some European regions, the role of local bodies in promoting new tourism models, and the future of mass-attended cultural and sporting events. As you might know, at Diplocat, we specialize in public diplomacy. We build bridges between Catalonia and the rest of the world. We facilitate the exchange of people, ideas, and projects. We do it with public diplomacy tools such as international debates like this one. The aim is, above all, to share knowledge and exchange good practices between sub-state entities and other international actors on the strategies to follow in the immediate future. In the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, regional, local, and sub-state governments, mainly in Europe and the United States, have established their own approaches in the face of their recommendations, statements, and instructions of their respective central and federal governments. However, their role in the recovery process will be no less important, given that many of them have responsibilities in economic, tourism, and cultural dynamism. I'm convinced that Catalonia must push, as it has always done, towards a redefinition of the European framework that prioritizes multi-level governance and decentralization. This is the reason why I believe that the debate that we are holding today is absolutely timely. Having said that, all that is left for me to do is to wish you a very fruitful and rich debate. And now I would like to give the floor to the moderator of the debate, Marc Sanjaume, Professor of Political Science at Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, Adjunct Professor at Universitat Pompeu Fabra, and member of the Political Theory Research Group. Marc, the floor is yours.
Thank you for organizing this debate, to the whole team of the Diplocat and Centre d'Estudis de Temes Contemporanis. This is an extremely relevant debate in our days. In the academia, there has been a sort of a boom of research related to this pandemic, and today is a good opportunity to talk about policies to fight against this virus, and how these policies are related to territory and territorial design of political systems. We do know a lot already about this pandemic. We know that there is a lot of variability of institutional responses to the crisis. We do know that this variability is related to success in fighting the virus. Governments more responsive and taking earlier measures to counteract these virus effects have been more successful in avoiding deaths and the spread of these pandemics. But we also ignore a lot of things. We do not know which specific policies and related to the territorial dimension, which specific territorial settings are better to tackle this pandemic. We have seen diverse responses, as you already mentioned. We have seen countries reacting in a very centralized ways. For instance, Spain or India centralizing regional powers, state powers to the federal or the central government in order to declare a state of emergency and take measures against the virus. But we also have seen more, let's say, decentralized and federal, in a more federal spirit, answers to the crisis. For example, Canada, Australia, and Germany have been reacting to the crisis in a very federal and decentralized way. And so we would like to know more about this phenomenon and about this territorial dimension. This is not only relevant from an academic perspective or for scholars working on federalism, but this is also relevant for, this is a matter of public interest. The more we know about public policies to fight the virus, the more effective we will be against working against this pandemic. So I would like to present the panel we have today to talk about centralization and decentralization policies against COVID-19. We have invited experts on the field, experts on federalism and multi-level governance, territorial conflicts, and this kind of research. We'll have first Professor Nicola McEwan from University of Edinburgh talking about the United Kingdom case. Then we will talk about Italy with Professor Francesco Palermo from EURAC in Bolzano. Then we'll talk about the German and the Swiss cases with Johanna Schnabel from University of Caen and University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And finally, we will also talk about the case of Catalonia in Spain with Mireia Grau from Institut d'Estudis de l'Autogovern. So I give the floor to Professor McEwan from Scotland, from University of Edinburgh. I ask you to first talk about your case studies. So we'll do a first round on your country response to the crisis regarding this territorial dimension. And then in a second part of the debate, we will talk from a more general perspective and comparative perspective. We'll try to find answers. We'll try to find policy recommendations from this more territorial perspective on how to fight this virus. So Professor McEwan, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us to this panel.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the invitation to join. I'm very glad to be here. You talked about the variations that we've seen in some countries, with some federal countries stepping up their intergovernmental coordination. In other cases, we've seen a centralization of power. In the United Kingdom, we haven't seen either of these things. We've seen something of a muddling through. And part of understanding the developments in the United Kingdom required us to think about its peculiar nature of multi-level government and the very, very deep asymmetry where we have devolution in Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland, but with by far the largest nation of England being governed solely by the UK government. And that has shaped the response to COVID-19. It's probably helpful to think of the response in three phases. In the first phase, and we might call that the four nations approach. That's certainly the language that has been used by all of the governments to talk about a four nations model of responding to COVID-19. And here the governments worked very closely together in the early phase of the pandemic as they tried to get an understanding of the virus and its spread, as they worked together and in concert to reach decisions over lockdown and to coordinate some of the practical policy responses as well. So very much a uniform approach, but none of that was through existing machinery of intergovernmental relations. None of it was through new processes of intergovernmental relations. Instead, what happened was that within the UK government, the civil contingencies machinery, there's a committee that goes by the name of COBRA, which is the Cabinet Office rooms where they meet to deal with emergency situations. All of that was initiated very quickly and very rapidly. Now that is Whitehall machinery, that is UK government machinery. But in this case, the devolved governments, the ministers from the devolved governments were invited to attend. And through that process, they cooperated together to reach common decisions. The high point of that was an action plan document in early March, which was simultaneously published by the 4 administrations. And it appears very much as an intergovernmental approach, even though the processes underpinning it were very much within the UK government. Now, part of what underpinned that common approach was the fact that so much of this was driven by science. The Scientific Advisory Committee that is advising the UK government is also advising the other administrations as well. So they're drawing upon a common scientific knowledge. And that helped to nurture cooperation between the health officials that were advising each of the administrations, and it helped to ensure that in the early stages they were doing things broadly together and at the same time. But let's move on now to phase 2, which is the phase that we are in right now, which is the easing of lockdown. And that collaborative approach appears to have broken down. There is still a common scientific base. They are still drawing on scientific knowledge to the extent that they are doing so, and there may be some variations between the administrations there. But we see each administration, each of which has its own policy responsibility for public health in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England, making slightly different decisions at slightly different times. And we see the UK government making policy for England, which is going at a much faster pace in terms of easing the lockdown than we see in the other devolved territories. Part of that is not just about science, because they're all drawing upon the same science, but it's also about politics, and it's also about concern for the economy. And the UK government has much more responsibility constitutionally for the economy and for economic recovery. So that might be factoring into the situation as well. So part of the consequence of that is that there are elements of confusion. So sometimes we see quite minor differences in policy that don't always make a lot of sense. So, or it's difficult to see the sense in them. So, for example, you can have public gatherings. You can get together with 1 or 2 households in Scotland with up to 8 people, but in England with only up to 6 people. And sometimes you can use a toilet if you live in one in someone else's house if you live in England, but not if you live in Wales. So there are minor differences that seem quite silly because they're making decisions separately and at separate times. And the communication and the coordination that was there in the early phase appears to have broken down. But I think as we move further into the easing of the lockdown and into phase 3, which I see as the recovery phase, the economic recovery phase, and we're not there yet, but that will come once the immediate emergency is passed. That's where the really big political differences might come to the fore. And here there is an asymmetry in the constitutional responsibilities of the administrations, where each of the governments equally has responsibility for public health. The UK government controls the fiscal levers that will be needed to address the economic challenges ahead. And it's not clear yet whether they will seek to use those in cooperation and in collaboration with the devolved governments, or whether some of the tensions between the administrations that have been apparent for quite a long time, long before COVID, whether these come to the fore. Now, in the UK, every country is going to have enormous economic challenges coming out of this. In the UK, we also uniquely have the challenge of Brexit happening at the same time, and the UK government has already made a commitment that it will not seek an extension to the transition period. Brexit has created some tensions between the governments. They are at very different places with respect to Brexit, and that is possibly influencing the way that they approach phase 3 of the pandemic as well. I think there are very big tests ahead in the way that the UK and the different governments in the UK manage the ongoing easing of lockdown, and in particular the recovery period as well. And much of that is taking place within a wider context in which the relationships between the governments have been strained, particularly by Brexit, but in the case of the Scottish Government, also by the wider constitutional debate over Scottish independence. Those issues have been sidelined in the midst of the emergency, but they're very much still part of the relevant context, and they add to the stakes that are there for all of the governments in the decisions that they are confronted with and will have to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor McEwan. Now we know more on the UK and Scotland. We will talk about that later again. I give the floor to Professor Francesco Palermo from the research center EURAC in South Tyrol, Bolzano-Bozen. Hi, Professor Palermo.
Hi.
The floor is yours.
Mark, thank you everyone for this highly interesting seminar. I could do it extremely short by saying exactly the same as Nicola has just done, because the situation in Italy is pretty much the same. I would say except Brexit, of course, but not entirely even in that respect, because the relations with the European Union and the financial mechanisms that have been put in place to address this crisis are a big bone of contention as well. So perhaps even with regard to the European dimension, there is a lot of similarity. What is similar, actually, the two different stages. In the first and more critical moment of the emergency, of course, there has been uniformity, and the regions have kind of accepted that and played around the national rules. Then in the second phase, differentiation has become much more acute, and there has been some litigation. And the challenges that we are currently facing are particularly with regard to the intergovernmental relations, because like in the UK, these are not sufficiently developed in general, and in this crisis also informal mechanisms have been established and put in place. So essentially the same broader picture. More in detail, why is Italy interesting in that respect? Because it is an extremely decentralized country without being a typical federal country, and especially what is missing in the federal culture. And this is quite remarkable, especially in this moment, because we see that actually there is a the tendency to miss the point in the political debate. I will come to that at the end. There is a strong asymmetry, and actually what has happened and is happening shows the pros and cons of decentralization, which is what we are going to discuss in the second round. So very briefly, already on the 31st of January, the government declared a state of emergency. based on the law on civil protection, which means not based on the constitution, because the constitution in that respect doesn't say anything. The constitution provides for the possibility for the government to adopt acts which have the same standing as laws and need to be ratified by parliament within 2 months. And these have been actually the legal basis for adopting some emergency measures that have been then specified by administrative acts issued by the very national government. The consequence of that was that the specific measures, like the very detailed ones, are very difficult to challenge, especially in front of the Constitutional Court. And the regions were left very little margin in the first phase. And as I said, they were not totally unhappy with that initially. They got angry later on when the measures started to be eased and almost entirely lifted step by step. Because then, of course, regions came back in the scenery, so to say, and clearly wanted to use their powers. Especially, I mean, this tension between the national power with regard to public security on the one hand, and the decentralized, the regional power with regard to healthcare have kind of crashed into another, and a lot of litigation has emerged in that respect. What is particular with Italy is the asymmetry, not only in terms of division of powers, but also in terms of the impact of the pandemic. Actually, Italy has been hit first, but in practice, 70% of the cases, almost 70% of the cases, originate in one region. Of course, a very important one, the most populous one, which is Lombardy, the area around Milan. But the other regions have been much less affected. A couple of other regions had some severe problems, but managed it very well, while this region of Lombardy did it very badly. So again, you see pros and cons of a federal type of approach. Of course, you can have more levels that can make mistakes, but at the same time, and the big advantage of that is that you also have many more opportunities to redress the potential mistakes. What has happened that in this second stage, some regions have started to adopt their own measures, and the national government was not overly happy with that and challenged most of them in the administrative courts. Only one region, which is the region of South Tyrol, where I am based, so the northernmost region at the border with Austria, which has a predominantly German-speaking population, has adopted a law. And this has caused some scandal initially, how their regions adopt their own laws, and the government challenged that to the Constitutional Court. This is still pending, but now political is no longer an issue, and it has worked pretty well. So again, much ado about nothing, one could say, but this shows the lack of federal culture I was referring to in the beginning. So now the debate is whether further centralization should be put in place, because many people, of course, especially where there is total ignorance, I would say, of what federalism is about, still consider that, of course, how can you imagine to come up with 20 different healthcare systems, and we need to have the same rule for everyone, and the usual type of arguments that are brought in this regard. But others also claim that actually this very crisis has shown that actually a differentiated approach is much more efficient. Where perhaps a better response is needed is in terms of the instruments for coordinating the action of the various regions. So the debate is open. I will stop here, and we will come back to some examples if there is interest in the second round. Thank you so far.
Thank you, Professor Palermo. We have a very active audience, and I can see some questions already coming in. Very interesting questions. We'll tackle these issues later. I see how the narratives from United Kingdom and Italy fit more or less. Let's see now to other federal cases. In this case, very let's say old established federations, Germany and Switzerland, even older, with Professor Johanna Schnabel from University of Kent and University of Lausanne. Professor Schnabel, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Hi, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for the invitation. Germany and Switzerland lend themselves very nicely for a comparison because their approaches have been very different. So in Germany, and that's quite surprising, the Länder are in charge of introducing the main measures to contain the spread of the virus. So they have decided to ban mass gatherings, to close schools, and so on. The federal government has a coordinating role in all this, and it can issue recommendations, and it has fulfilled this coordinating role by organizing weekly meetings with the premiers of the Länder. Usually these meetings were followed by a joint press conference in which they announced agreement on the introduction of a number of measures. So that has been a quite coordinated approach between the Länder and the federal government. This being said, the Länder have also shown their own initiatives, especially in the crisis. The Länder have decided to close schools even before these meetings with the federal government happened. And Bavaria has been, in a way, with Lombardy. It has been the land that has been hit first and more severely than other Länders. So Bavaria has pushed ahead quite early on and has enacted quite strict measures. Now we can see after Germany reached its peak, the Länder have been pushing for an easing of the restrictions. The federal government has been quite reluctant initially. So eventually agreement was reached that the easing of the restrictions would be left to the Länder. They would ease the restrictions on their own. So you can see a quite important role played by the Länder. In Switzerland, the situation is very different. So in Switzerland, again, that is quite surprising. The federal government has significant powers. And so it is the federal government that decided to ban mass gatherings, to close schools, to close restaurants, and so on. So Ticino is Switzerland's Bavaria or Lombardy. Ticino has been hit first and much more severe than the other cantons. And so Ticino has reacted earlier, has imposed measures, has imposed stricter measures. But as soon as the federal government took action, Ticino had to play by the federal government's rules, or these rules applied to Ticino. However, to acknowledge Ticino's specific situation, the federal government has allowed, but again, it has allowed, it has decided to have stricter rules. The federal government has even overruled decisions by the cantons, such as URIs, to impose curfew on senior citizens, which has led to quite some frustration by URI's government. Whereas in Germany, the introduction of measures has been coordinated. In Switzerland, coordination has been limited to the implementation of the measures, because even though the federal government decides on the introduction of measures, they are implemented by the cantons. So the cantons have coordinated that. Now, recently, we have seen after, again, Switzerland reached the peak and the federal government has recently ended a state of emergency, it has returned powers to the cantons. So from now on, it's again the cantons are in charge of easing the restrictions further and of the next steps should, for example, a second wave occur. So, and I'm going to end on this. We see a strong degree of decentralization, but coordination in Germany, and a quite unusual degree of centralization in Switzerland. Thank you.
I see. Well, thank you very much, Professor Schnabel, providing this evidence from Germany and Switzerland, a different picture than the UK and Italian cases. Let's move on to the case of Spain with Mireia Grau, and then we'll do a second round in this debate, comparing cases from a more theoretical perspective. But first, let's talk about Spain and Catalonia. Mireia Grau, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for invitation, and as we are short of time, I go straight to the point. My first reaction in trying to sort out this talk was to think about whether decentralization responses or centralization responses were more efficient or in dealing with the crisis, but I found out that we don't have enough data or enough perspective to assess this. But it's true that during all this time, we've seen several posts, academic posts, analyzing the different answers that different governments have provided to the pandemic. The first thing that strikes me is to think that this is an institutional choice. So whether governments could decide between decentralized or centralized in such a rush time and providing a quick answer. So the same way that we don't think that France could react differently, that was my first idea. So federal countries can decide between being or could have decided between choosing a more decentralized or more decentralized way of doing. The case of Spain is a hyper centralization response, and everybody knows it's not a mystery, is not a surprise. From the first moment, the lower chamber of the parliament declared the state of emergency, so no intervention of other institutional actors but the members of the Congreso and the government, declaring the state of emergency that re-devolved the powers of the autonomous communities to a single commandment. All fair enough, I mean, constitutionally impeccable, no problems with that, but it shows that the margin of institutional maneuver that central government had was very small. There was no much way of dealing, institutionally speaking, that re-centralizing everything. And it's so easy to do that. That's the first point. So what I think it's interesting in this case is how easy it was to re-devolve all the powers to a single commandment led by central government. Of course, immediately it was perceived that although there was a single commandment, all these years, the health system, the management of the health system was in the territories, in the autonomous communities. So a kind of intergovernmental relation had to be established. And now it's again another weakness of the system that appeared, that they realized how this machinery, intergovernmental machinery, was so poorly established, because I mean, they organized on the Sunday after the declaration of the state of emergency, an intergovernmental conference with the premiers of all the autonomous communities to inform them about the decisions. So this conference that existed a long time ago, they had only called it twice before. So the political intergovernmental setting was clearly perceived as a complete void. There wasn't a practice of the political system to decide jointly on these issues. And the answer is very clear, or very evident to me. I mean, there hasn't been for years, they hadn't thought about this, but suddenly all the autonomous communities realize that they don't have any access to state decision-making. Of course, some autonomous communities more than others, but that was the first reality. And you could start seeing some of the premiers of the autonomous communities, not the Catalan, not the Basque only, claiming that, well, I mean, that wasn't very fair, that they didn't have any voice in all that. They just had to go and listen to what the single commandant had decided, because they had to implement through the mechanism they had all the measures. Diversity was no way a possibility. And I just remember at the beginning, when the first royal decree, there was something that created a lot of jokes about the hairdresser. So we could do absolutely nothing, but we could go to the hairdresser. And then the president, the primer of the Madrid community, decided that that wasn't possible. So she announced that she would not allow people to go to the hairdresser. And immediately central government said, no, that's not on your powers anymore. So suddenly everyone realized that the share rule was not just weak, but absent. And this point was repeatedly going on in one way or another in all the phases. At one point, central government in minority realized that just for party politics, they needed to concede some aspects that the autonomous communities, through the parties that were represented in the Congreso, had to say. So from the first month of a highly centralized decision-making process to a second phase in which the representatives of the government of the autonomous community through party politics in the Congreso started a negotiation process in some issues. But the point is that from the perspective of the institutional setting, it is true that the emergency state didn't allow any intervention of the autonomous communities, institutionally speaking. There were no mechanism for share rule. And that's incredibly interesting because it puts for the first time a debate in which everybody seems to agree that share rule is inexisting in Spain. And for the same rule as share rule is not existing in Spain, we can start talking about something that is more controversy, which is whether self-rule is enough or not enough. Because share rule cannot exist without really established self-rule, and self-rule cannot exist without established share rule. So in all, the hyper-centralized response of the Spanish central government, leaving aside the autonomous communities, was not an institutional choice. It was the only choice they could go through. So showing is an indicator of the nature of the decentralization in Spain. I think I will leave my intervention here and go ahead with details if needed. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mireia Grau, for this evidence from Spain and Catalonia. So I think we have more or less tackled this descriptive part. Now we know more about these cases. We see a lot of variation across country and across time. Across country, we see a huge difference between the case of the UK, Italy, and Spain, between these cases and the cases of Germany and Switzerland. The latter have been more federal in their answer, in the response to the crisis. Whereas in the other cases, there has been a more centralized approach, at least at the first moment, because there is also cross-time variation. So I see that this first centralized reaction, at least in Italy and Spain, and then more leeway to the regions in this de-escalation phase after the first reaction, at least in Italy, and perhaps we could add now in Spain. So let's move to the second part of the debate, and a less descriptive part and a more analytical, I would say. We don't have, as Mireia Grau said, we don't have enough evidence to draw final conclusions on that. But I would like to ask you, what is better? What do you think would have been better? We social scientists, we like counterfactual thinking. So have these centralized or decentralized or federal or non-federal reactions in these countries been better, made better or worse results in fighting the crisis. What do you think about that? As one of our listeners said in the chat, is small is beautiful? Is small reaction beautiful, or is it better to take a more centralized approach? That would be the first question. And related to this question, I would like to ask you, are there any policy recommendations you would do at this point? Again, I know we don't have enough evidence, but I would like to ask you, as experts on this topic, would you recommend? Would you do some recommendations to governments on this territorial dimension in fighting the crisis? So I open the floor now again for Professor McEwan, and then we will follow the same order in this more analytical part of the debate. So, Professor McEwan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mark. I think before trying to answer your question directly, I would want to sort of underline that uniformity and centralization aren't the same thing. So I talked about in the early phase in the UK, there was a uniformity of approach, but that was decided by all of the administrations to do that. It wasn't decided by centralized authority. So these are two quite different things. I think centralized authority, it's too early to tell. As you said, it's too early to tell which is the most effective, and it would very much depend on what we meant by effective. Effective in what respect? We don't know that yet. But I would suggest that centralizing power is not necessarily the most effective, and nor indeed is uniformity of approach either. They have some strengths. They can clarify the legal picture. They can make it easy for people to understand the message if there's only one message. So that has its advantages, but it's not sustainable in a multi-level state. And even in the countries where we have seen centralization to begin with, or uniformity to begin with, and then we start to see variation emerging at later stages, then unless there is clarity around why the shift, why uniformity, and then why variation, and who precisely messages are targeted to, then it can become a cause for some confusion. I think it's very interesting that we have identified in the cases of Italy and in Spain and in the UK, where there has been a lack of a federal culture, that you have seen a lack of, forgive me, the dog's barking, we have seen a lack of joined up thinking, joined up policy making, particularly in the UK at the easing of lockdown stage of the process. But in the UK, the lack of a federal culture didn't lead to resentment at variation. I would say it was more bewilderment. And I think that probably also speaks again to the asymmetry and a lack of understanding within England about devolution, and actually sometimes within the UK government about devolution. So one of the legacies might be that there is greater understanding here as well. One of the reasons why I thought uniformity is not necessarily the best approach is that it can come at the cost of policy innovation. If you uniformly make a bad policy choice, then it affects everybody in the same way. And so some of the reasons why we have multi-level government in the first place might be also some of the reasons why it's attractive and appealing and probably appropriate to have at least the opportunity to tailor policies to local need and to local preferences and to local institutional structures. And I think we have seen that in the cases where there has been the permission to have variation. Centralizing power can also lead to resentment in the short, medium and longer term. And that creates additional challenges for governing in complex, territorial complex and plurinational states. And I think we've heard some of that already in the contributions. So it's difficult to finally talk about whether one approach is more effective than the other. They have advantages and they have disadvantages and they have risks and opportunities. But what I think is really interesting, what we don't yet understand, is that while Spain, Italy, the UK approach this in ways that we might have expected them to, we see some examples like the Swiss example, like the Australian example, that have maybe approached this in ways that we wouldn't have expected them to, that haven't quite been with the tradition. And those are really interesting things to unpack and explore when we have a little bit more time and a little bit more evidence. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor McEwan. So I really appreciate these observations. Professor Palermo, do you agree with that? This difference between uniformity and centralization and these ideas on the costs on policy innovation and so on that Professor McEwan was explaining right now. What's your idea on that?
Well, yes, I certainly agree, and I would even add one more layer of complexity, which I would say the coordination is different from centralization. And what we have seen in many countries is that these two things have been mixed up. So take the example of Switzerland, which is probably one of the most decentralized countries worldwide. There has been no question about, the fact that the national government, especially in the most delicate moments, could have a coordinating effect. But I mean, this is coordination. In Germany, even more. I mean, there has been, the power has been seized even from the national government. So we should perhaps talk on another occasion about, the relationship between politics and expertise, right? Because actually the power in Germany has been seized by the Robert Koch Institute, and that's it. I mean, very little room for the Länder too, but still. Nobody was imposing. It was about really coordinating. And federalism doesn't mean that everyone goes its own way. Federalism means that there is a meaningful system to coordinate actions. And of course, even the national dimension has been far too small for these things. So it's not about small is beautiful. I mean, of course, you cannot fight a pandemic at the municipal level. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Not even at state, national level. It's too small too. Perhaps even the continental level is not enough. So what we are needing is actually more effective coordination, which doesn't mean imposition from the top down. And this is what we have seen in most cases, especially in the three non-formally federal cases we are dealing with today. The other thing is that constitutions have proven overall to be not fully equipped. And this is a more general issue that goes even beyond centralization and decentralization. In that respect, it's interesting because in the Italian parliament, a few proposals for constitutional amendment have been presented, just copy-pasting Article 116 of the Spanish Constitution. Well, Mireia has told that this is not all, such a fantastic thing. Probably it's just a constitutional clean way to simply exclude the subnational governments from, any decision making. But at least it is constitutionally clean. At least there is a procedure. At least there is something which is probably what most constitutions need, not in terms of what this provision tell, but at least to have a provision, to have some procedural mechanisms to deal with these issues. The second question that was raised about, recommendation. Of course, I mean, we cannot recommend much because, as others have said, also the data are lacking. But I think we can sketch some potential ways, at least. One is, I think the best argument for a decentralized approach, which doesn't mean, as I said, each one goes its own way, is the two most dramatic failures we are witnessing right now, which are two federal countries, Brazil and the United States. I mean, no one wishes, and not also don't want to say that the rulers, the presidents in the two countries are simply unfit to make the right decisions. But still, it's pretty clear that the states have played an important role in limiting what seems to be a scientifically not very well-grounded approach taken by the national leaders. So if only for that reason, I think a more decentralized structure helps. The second thing is that while, of course, you can have mistakes at subnational level too, and what has happened in Lombardy in Italy is clearly an example of that. I mean, it was a regional decision to take some positive, COVID-positive people into the elderly homes, which has, been a disaster, and that was not because of the national government. So one could argue, yes, then of course it's better to have the national government to take care of all that. Well, precisely for this reason, you see that while mistakes cannot entirely be avoided, you have many more reasons from learning from one another. By the way, politically, it's quite interesting. I think this could be also another topic, that the presidents or the governors or whatever they're called, prime ministers of the various regions, in all countries got a lot of attention and are actually benefiting politically a lot from that. So I think this all shows that actually differentiation is in fact, even if it's not in laws, it is in fact. So there is no other meaningful way to approach that. So after all, I think while we cannot make clear recommendations, we can at least see that the advantages of a decentralized solution combined with the strong intergovernmental processes are certainly a much more meaningful way of approaching this sort of problems.
Thank you, Professor Palermo. I see your points, and I would like to hear Professor Schnabel on these conceptual distinctions that we have been drawing and these experiences that Professor McEwan and Palermo were talking about. Professor Schnabel, on Germany and Switzerland, and more in general, this general picture. What do you think about that?
So I think I will not contradict what Nicola and Francesco have already said. I wanted to add one element to the discussion about advantages of decentralization, and it's something I think we have also seen all the different federations, is that individual regions or constituent units, whatever you want to call them, have been exposed to different degrees to the virus. So in every country we have a few regions that have been exposed much more severely than others. And I think that's also one advantage of decentralization, that we can tailor the measures to the degree of exposure. And there has, for example, been some dissatisfaction in the German-speaking part of Switzerland about the strictness of measures that were mainly based on the situation in the Lake Geneva area, so the French-speaking part. And so more responsibilities on the subnational level helps here to tailor these measures to the degree of exposure. But that obviously comes with the downside of having a patchwork of measures, which is, for example, something that the Germans don't really like. So if you live in a border region, it might be quite difficult to actually know what the rules are in one of the länder. And yeah, so if you cross the border, you might not know anymore what the rules are there. So I think there is this trade-off involved in decentralization. Now, centralization seems to do more justice to the national scope of the bigger scope of the crisis, but then obviously comes with the disadvantages of this blanket approach that you have just described. And so I think I very much agree with Nicola and Francesco that the discussion about centralization, decentralization is not the only one we should have when it comes to federalism or territorial politics. And I think one reason why this is the case is also that Germany and Switzerland, who represent these two different approaches, have both done very, very well, which obviously also relates to factors that are completely or more independent of the federal system. And to this, I have two thoughts to share, and I think one of them relates to what Mireia has already said. Federalism usually, or decentralized system, exists for reasons that are independent of emergency management most of the time. So I think in a way, crisis management needs to operate within the framework that exists. And I think this is why coordination is so important. So it's naive to believe that either one level of government can handle the crisis on its own. They must coordinate. They are in this together. And so I think here the question that we need to think about is, actually I have three questions, and they are: when, what, and where does coordination happen? And here we could observe that coordination, there has been much more coordination in the lockdown phase of this public health crisis. And I think this is related, because there is more pressure to coordinate, but also because that strong problem pressure makes it easier to coordinate, because parties can put their conflicts aside for the time being. So it's much more difficult once the problem pressure declines. The next question is, what is coordinated? And so here we could see in Germany, the introduction of measures was coordinated and their implementation. In Switzerland, only the implementation was coordinated. So I think one, let's say, best practice or one lesson we could learn is that coordination needs to include both. And that relates to the third element, is where does coordination happen? That's also something that Mireia has already mentioned. Both Germany and Switzerland have very well-developed systems of intergovernmental councils, coordinated practices, arrangements, and so on. And I think it helps to have these arrangements that they can then just be used. And I think one reason why in Germany so much coordination has happened is that in Germany everything is always coordinated. So yeah, that helps a lot. There's usually, when it comes to crisis, be they financial or public health crisis, the question is, do they lead to more centralization? And as far as I know, there's no evidence that these crises lead to long-term centralization. So even in Switzerland, the federal government has now returned power to the cantons. But I think what the crisis shows us is coordination problems. And so I think, and I'll end on that, is that these coordination problems are what we should look at and what we should learn from to prevent further crises. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schnabel, for this wrap-up of arguments. This is really useful. I can see the arguments on coordination, and we have a last intervention on this more theoretical perspective from Mireia Grau, and then we'll move on to the debate. I already see some debate in our YouTube chat. Our listeners continue to be very, very active. I promise we will address these questions in a minute. Before that, Mireia Grau, what do you think about these ideas?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I cannot just say, but I agree with all them. Yes, I think the word is coordination, but the exact meaning differs across countries. So we used to say years ago from the Catalan government, when some coordination was promoted in Madrid, they come here to cooperate us. So there was always this idea, mixing centralization, cooperation. I mean, the idea, the hierarchical way of cooperation is inserted in central government institutions. So it's very difficult. I mean, I'm not saying anything, but just that is path dependency. The system is so centralized that the only way that can react immediately is by these instruments that confuse cooperation with I cooperate you. So of course, the good thing is that the whole crisis has put in all countries this need to cooperate with all levels of government, not just saying in the national level, but also internationally speaking, and also locally. I mean, why not? I mean, we're talking about municipalities if they were just there to obey. So, but that's very difficult if you don't have a background of this institutional way of moving. I mean, when central government in Spain look backwards and say, well, what we have in order to coordinate, it was just this centralizing perspective of coordination. And I think they mean, in a way, all actors, academics, politicians realize of that. I mean, some autonomous communities, the leaders of some autonomous communities, that they didn't fight for self-government levels or whatsoever, they realized they didn't have a voice in all this system. And that has an impact on the whole legitimacy of the institutional setting. So whether they will learn from it or not is different. I mean, it's a different question, but at least it has put this idea on the political debate. And as far as there are no institutional mechanism to ease this coordination, the problem is it goes back to party politics. So if it goes back to party politics, it would depend on majorities, on coalitions, and whatsoever. So it would be always unstable. But that's what happens. So the idea is, yes, I mean, I think all systems should learn from the failure of coordinating structures, especially in multi-level countries, in which it's not related to the degree of satisfaction, but at least if the distribution of powers provides different instruments of implementing and deciding the policies, you have to coordinate this. You can't just impose. So that's something that I think all countries have more or less put into the surface in the crisis. Different thing is whether they will learn from it.
Thank you, Professor Mireia Grau. Yeah, I really agree with your arguments. So we are now at the end of the second part. I can see common points among you. I had a couple of concerns or ideas on this topic that we did not cover. One was already mentioned by Mireia Grau, party polarization and territorial conflict more in general. How this polarization overlaps with the territorial dimension. This would be one quick question if one of you wants to answer. We have seen some polls recently predicting a rise of secessionist support, at least in Scotland. We have also seen partisan division overlap with the regional setting in Spain, as Mireia already mentioned, and I would like to hear more about that. And then there are a couple of questions from our audience that I would like to address. The first one is about compliance. So we didn't talk specifically about that, but one very powerful argument for centralization, at least in communicative terms or in terms of the message from governments, is that one single message from central government or from federal institutions, a single message is more effective than multiple messages across territories. So I would also like to hear you about that. And just a final idea that has also been raised by our listeners on the European Union. Sorry, Professor McEwan, but we have this idea that the European Union is like the elephant in the room, right? So the European Union is there, has always been there, but we haven't seen the European Union managing the crisis at all. So I would like to hear your thoughts about how the European Union would have improved this answer to this response to the crisis. We don't have much time. We have 10 minutes, so just pick one of these topics and hear with us your thoughts. There is no order here, so the first who wants to step in, the floor is yours.
Well, perhaps I will start. I mean, on the single message point, I think it depends on the message and it depends on the messenger. And so in the UK context, when you have a prime minister who is very polarizing, let's say, then having a single message wouldn't necessarily be more effective or incur more compliance. And we've seen opinion polls in Scotland, certainly, that have quite significant variations in levels of trust in the message coming from the Scottish government, which is generally more trusted than the UK government. So if the UK government in that context was the sole messenger, then it might actually have an adverse effect on compliance. And perhaps I'll just address the constitutional issue that you mentioned, Mark, because that's obviously a very high salience issue in the UK, where there have been demands for a new independence referendum in Scotland, demands that have been rejected by the UK government. Now, the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, made a decision to park the independence process, so that her sole focus was on addressing the pandemic. And officials who were working on that were redeployed, and she has been at pains to stress that normal politics, including constitutional politics, have to be left to the side. But that doesn't mean that they're not still there. And we have seen very sustained levels of support for independence at least 50-50, with the latest poll suggesting increases in support as well. I think the last one was about 54%, but we don't know until we see some more if that is signalling a rise. So I think the way that the governments respond in the crisis, the way that they act and the way that they are perceived will still have an effect on that wider constitutional debate. But there are very big challenges ahead, particularly related to the economic recovery, because it's an profound economic recession is normally not one that we might think would be conducive to secessionist politics, and it would create further challenges in that context, but it does sort of pose big questions for devolution too. And I think it really depends, back to that coordination point again, if the governments can coordinate and work together, or if they are competing with each other, and that will feed into the constitutional question.
Well, that's an open debate, so yeah, the floor is yours. I think who wants to say?
I would leave the political scientists talk first, and then as a lawyer to conclude in a very short manner.
So, yeah, Professor Schnabel, if you want, yeah.
I don't think I can say much actually, but just say something or not saying much. I think what we have seen, at least in Germany and Switzerland, when it comes to party politics, is that the crisis has put those aside for some time. At least in lockdown phase, everybody agreed. I'm not aware that there was any partisan disagreement on the importance of imposing those measures. I think in Switzerland, potentially the SVP, the right-wing party, might have been dissatisfied with the state telling, or the government telling people what to do. But other than that, I don't see any differences here. That might change now when after the lockdown, when it comes to economic recovery and fiscal stimulus and so on. But other than that, I don't see any. That might be different in Spain, I presume.
Yeah.
Well, yes. I mean, I think the biggest problem that the Spanish institutional setting has is that it's hyper-centralized in the central government structures. I mean, the ministries are the same as 50 years ago. Some of the ministries exist on powers that are the autonomous communities' power. So this perspective is more, it's a handicap for coordination, because it always turns towards the idea that there's one single point that coordinates the rest, and an umbrella perspective. The good thing about the crisis in terms of the federal system or the institutional setting is that it has put on light all that. So something that was in the shadow, because we have more focus on the idea of whether self-government was enough or too much, no, and all the tensions going on. You have too many powers, you should have less, or no, I have enough, all that. Suddenly, we turn to this area, share rule. But share rule doesn't exist because, in a way, self-government is very restricted. So the crisis has put light, or has focused on some areas that the debate hadn't engaged before. And if there's a real learning process and all that, institutional learning process, the focus cannot be just, we will increase the number of conferences and all that, without touching the protection of self-government. Because how easy it was to re-devolve everything to central government. It's perfectly constitutional. I'm not saying it was illegitimate, but it was very easy. So one have to think about this. I mean, a system in which self-government is so easily turned off, there's a problem if you want to call it decentralized system. And then it goes to a pandemic like this or an emergency crisis like this to realize that you haven't involved the units in decision-making process, because of course the big decisions, the core political decisions, you're taking yourself. But in a moment you need to all the instruments to deal with it, you find there is a void in the intergovernmental area. And that cannot be solved in a minute. So that's, I think, the big, or the most interesting lesson we can have in the Spanish system. I mean, I'm not talking about the success rate or no. I mean, it's something that I'm not an expert, so I'm not. But what I know about is about institutional setting, and this is, on my opinion, what it has shown the most in this crisis.
Professor Palermo, as a lawyer and as an expert in legal studies, let us know your thoughts about that. There are some questions addressed directly to you from our audience. One listener says, why, well, you said the management should be continental or even global, but this listener also thinks that management should be adapted to local requirements and conditions. So let us know your thoughts.
Yeah, very briefly, really like short answers. I would like to start where Mireia has ended. I mean, if there is something that we can learn from the Spanish and Italian experiences, that actually the systems are in fact much more centralized than they look on paper. So on paper, there is lots of decentralization, but in practice, because of the structure of ministries and all that, it's clearly different. So the crisis has certainly unveiled this. The question is the acceptance of that or not, and the response might be very different, I would say. And this depends, and that's the second point, on the political culture, on the party structure, of which I'm not an expert, so I wanted to skip that, but just want to make one point in that regard. Also, when we speak about secessionist movements and trends, they are by far not all the same. I mean, one thing is to speak about these issues in the context of Scotland or Catalonia, where at least pro-secession, potentially pro-secession political parties are in government. Another thing is to speak about that in the context of South Tyrol, for example, where there are some relevant political forces claiming for secession, but not being in parliament, not being in government, and not coming up with strong arguments. The only argument is, well, Austria would do it better. I mean, yeah, that's not such a convincing argument. So again, it's difficult to generalize, and the impact might be different on the case by case. And the final point about the question of the single message: is the single message more effective? No, not at all. I mean, rather the opposite, I would say. Why that? Because a single message implies that you have to take the maximum common denominator, not the minimum one. If you have a region, like again the case of Italy, where you have about 70% of the cases, well, the message and also the measures must be tailored to that case, right? Otherwise it's a disaster, which means that you completely neglect the situation in all the other territories. Is that meaningful? I mean, you might have some funny things, like in one region you can do certain things and in another region you cannot. This is the reality. I mean, I would claim for more complexity being a much more viable solution than what seems to be an easy response, which is completely nonsense. So I think we should start to fight intellectually the easy message, right? Because on this path, then the consequences might be extremely dangerous. And here we are talking about fundamental rights of people.
Thank you, Professor Palermo. Yeah, okay, I totally agree with these ideas. In fact, you haven't talked that much about the European Union. We have just a few minutes left. You have been avoiding this question. Do you want to keep this out of the panel?
No, I would like to say one sentence. The expectations about the European Union are probably wrongly posed. This is because of the simple message idea, probably. The European Union is not the fastest reacting institution. It takes time. It needs compromise, again, because it's luckily not in the position to impose things, but it needs to digest some difficult decisions. But you might like it or not, but in the long run it is working. It has shown some leadership. It has provided for something. We can disagree about the contents, of course, and the countries are still disagreeing, but I wouldn't say the European Union has been failing, at least not to the extent that opposers tend to say. Everything can be better, but certainly the European Union simply needs time. If you need a prompt reaction mechanism, you don't have to turn to the European Union.
Thank you, Professor. So we have a last word, last minute left. No? Mireia?
Well, going to the European Union, if you want, I think that we end up at the same thing. The pandemic has shown a scan, these scans of light of the world that you can see where more concentrated people are. So it has a scan where the power is. So, of course, the European Union was not very bright on this map. And for the same reasons that Francesco said, that it has the power not to have an immediate reaction, but also because, after all, the states keep the word for what they have to say on this area. So, I mean, I think what we have learned from this pandemic is where the real power lays. That's something, and from this we can start restructuring it if we want to. But it has shown where the power is more distributed and where, in a prompt reaction, powers got concentrated. So the same would apply to the European Union.
Thank you, Mireia, Grau.
Just one final comment from me, Mark. I think the European Union analogy and discussions of it being a slow responder might also, I think it's partly to do with the political culture and the institutional culture, but might also lead one to think that if you have to have a system of co-decision among multiple partners, then that will inevitably slow your response. And I think that's partly what drives centralization and emergency powers being utilized and invoked. But I think one of the things that I hope that we can learn from this and from looking at the issue comparatively is that coordination doesn't have to be slow. It doesn't have to slow things down. And I think if we can learn from the places that have managed to coordinate decision making, that doesn't need to be uniform. It can allow for variation, and to do that efficiently and effectively, then I think that will be a very valuable insight for other countries as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. We have one final minute. No. Okay. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm not in a position of summarizing all these ideas, evidence, arguments. This is food for thought, as they say, for sure. And we will continue working on that. Thank you to our listeners, to the audience for joining us. Thank you, professors, for being here today. And see you soon, and keep safe. Bye.